Video game genres are weird. They are some of the few things in the world where people just can't get along in what to name them. The other being music. Like how there's no distinct line to draw to differentiate electronic music and its multitude of sub-and-umbrella genres, it's extremely difficult to make a contrast between what constitutes as a roguelite and a roguelike, for example. Video games before were just called that. Video games. Tabletop games were just board games. Hell, before the Super Mario franchise became as big as it is, it was just called a Nintendo by the parents of that generation. Now we must be specific as to what we are referring to when talking about games. Is it played with a physical object that should be interactive with players? Does it have a board? Does it consist of more than 4 players and must be more than a 5-hour session sitting around the table while the mastermind behind the game read aloud the instructions, story, and character sheets? You can play an action RPG and you can also play an ARPG, that stands for Action RPG, and you will have a very different experience from one another. You can play a role-playing game, but you can also play an RPG, which also stands for role-playing game, and both games can't be any more different from each other. Play a game that's about killing a god through the power of friendship, and you can add the letter J on that acronym and it becomes an entirely different genre and experience. And all of these are also different from the 2 different ARPGs. It's nuts. This is why game store pages usually list down as many genres as they can, like on Steam. Developers and publishers use these genre tags not necessarily to categorize their games, but rather use it to low-key describe what their game is all about for those that don't like to read store page description. There's really no congress or association that monitors video game genres anyways, there's no passing law that you'd break if you call a game the wrong genre. You'd just spark a nonsensical debate somewhere online and probably waste an hour or two of a couple of people defending what genre the game should be categorized. However, there are a few outliers with this weird genre convention. These are the genres that combine 2 or more genres to give birth to a new one, Metroidvanias and Roguelikes to name a couple of them. And from then on, things such as Souls-like would be born from the Souls series, which is honestly a combination of elements from both Metroidvanias and roguelike themselves, while still having an element unique only to them. Seriously, I could go on and on about video game genres and their confusing mess, but the point I'm trying to make here is that it's really hard to come up with a new genre nowadays. While video games are evolving to be more and more complex as time passes, the way we categorize them through genres become more and more difficult, which is why we resort just using genres as some sort of shorthand description rather than a category that we can associate them. Not to mention that most games combine a lot of elements from other genres. And that's where Vampire Survivors comes into the picture. As with how a Souls-like game combines an action-adventure game with elements of semi-permadeath from roguelites and interconnected areas from pathways from a Metroidvania, Vampire Survivors coined the term Survivor-like, where it combines mainly elements of a roguelite with that of a shoot-'em-up and bullet hell. After all, why would you say such a mouthful description to describe the genre of a game where you can just put a like after the name of the game where this new game was inspired by and call it a new genre? Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to talk about the progenitor of Survivors-like games, Vampire Survivors. After the sudden boom of popularity Vampire Survivors had, it was inevitable that it will spawn a bunch of clones in the form of shitty mobile games. After all, Vampire Survivors was meant to be a mobile game in the first place, so it was easy for people who just want to make a couple of quick bucks to replicate and put up in the Google Play Store. But that's not all. Competent developers have also started to make games based on this gameplay of Vampire Survivors. The most prominent one in my opinion is Soulstone Survivor. And in the year that I've made this video, the developer behind Deep Rock Galactic is also making their Survivors-like game called Deep Rock Galactic Survivor. It's a trend that's not going to go away anytime soon. But these are not what we're going to talk about today. We're here to talk about what Vampire Survivors really is and if it's worth the $2 that it's selling for on Steam. Long story short, Vampire Survivors is a roguelike. You start with nothing and when you die, you gain some sort of currency that you can use to upgrade your early game for a more comfortable run in the future. You do this over and over again until you've unlocked everything there is to unlock. And then afterwards, you find a bunch of random weapons as you play through the game, find what synergizes the most from those weapons, and turn the game from a roguelite into an idle game where you just see your money and character level go up in numbers while you go watch YouTube. And that's really what the game is all about in a gist, really. It's a simple game with bare bones gameplay, it doesn't require that much strategy since most of it boils down to having good RNG, If you don't get weapons that synergize well with each other, or get weapons that don't really work on the build that you're planning on, you will die sooner or later. No questions asked. Although I guess you can say that to almost any other roguelites anyways. If that's more than enough for you to try the game out, its Steam store page will be down in the description below. If you want to learn more about the game to make sure that it's the game for you, then stay tuned and keep watching the video. This game doesn't have a story. Alright, fine, I'm not gonna skip this section. But it's true, the game doesn't have any story at all. There's a very loose plot about finding Dracula and killing him, hence the title Vampire Survivors. But other than that plot, there isn't really a storyline for people to follow. While each stage you unlock as you progress through the game feels like you're traveling from place to place to find Dracula, it's very similar to how the first Super Mario games did it with Saving Princess Peach, where they always say the princess in another castle for 4 times just to put the playtime to like an hour. Only in this game they say the vampires in another coffin for like 8 times and the playtime padded is like 100 hours. But even though the game doesn't really have a coherent storyline or at all, it is jam-packed full of references and Easter eggs from other media. The most prevalent of course is from Castlevania. In fact, the entire game is pretty much just a homage to the franchise with a bunch of Italian-based puns scattered here and there. I'm not Italian, so I don't know how accurate this is, but here's a Reddit post that lists some of them. And of course, the biggest punchline in this game is that there are no vampires to be found anywhere. Like, literally zero. The final boss, which I won't be showing here to avoid major spoiler, is also not Dracula or any other form of vampire. It's an entirely different creature that you cannot be more disconnected to any vampire lore or depiction. You don't fight any vampires at all. It's fucking genius. That's pretty much where the story is all about again, if you can call it a story at all. I guess the main selling point of the game aside from the gameplay itself of course, is the amount of Easter eggs that you can find in the game and the game itself being a huge homage to a really beloved franchise that unfortunately Konami has killed years ago, but that's a topic for another day. As I've preluded earlier in this video, Vampire Survivors is a roguelite mixed with the bullet hell elements which would later become the progenitor of a Survivors-like genre. As you start the game, you have nothing on you except for your character's starting weapon. However, the difference between this game and most roguelites is that you don't get weapons by picking them up in the overworld. You get weapons by leveling up. This mechanic is the biggest game changer that Vampire Survivors has introduced as a unique gameplay in my opinion. Instead of, say, in Risk of Rain and its sequel where you get weapons or upgrades in this game's case by exploring an opponent's chest, you get weapons and upgrades in Vampire Survivors by killing enemies, which infinitely incentivizes the players to find a way to kill enemies as quickly as possible. The player automatically attacks with all of their weapons regardless if there are enemies on the screen or not. And there aren't any buttons assigned to attack nor to stop attack. The game does it for you automatically and your job is to keep your character alive while collecting the experience gems that enemies drop to further gain weapons and upgrades. A character's starting weapon already fills up one of the player's 6 inventory slots, so they only have 5 remaining slots left for other weapons. This makes it so that you cannot just hoard everything you see on the screen, so while there really isn't any strategy involved in killing enemies since your character automatically does it for you, there is strategy needed in choosing what weapons you pick from the selection as your characters level up. For the astute audience, you may have noticed that there's another set of 6 boxes just below the weapon slots, and good job noticing those. Those are for the passive items that, as the name suggests, give passive abilities to your characters. And while that might sound not that all powerful, these items are extremely important. Not only because they give passive bonuses that apply to your weapons and sometimes enhance your character's survivability like giving them extra armor, HP or movement speed, among other examples, but also because they're what you need to evolve your weapons. And this is where the fun begins. As you may have noticed by now, most weapons that you get in the game looks kind of cool, sure, but they're also kind of underwhelming. Your whip only has 4 swipes, your knives can only attack in one direction, also looks flimsy as shit, and while the magic wand auto attacks the nearest enemy, it looks weak as fuck. That's where the passive item comes into play. If you're carrying the corresponding passive item that your weapons need, and your weapon is at the max level of 8, They will evolve once you get a treasure chest from boss enemies that spawn from time to time. These boss enemies are pretty hard to miss even though they look exactly the same as a normal enemy. They have tons of health, hits pretty hard, and they either have a blue outline on their sprite or they're much larger than the normal variants. Killing these enemies will give you a red experience gem that can sometimes give you more than one character level, and more often than not, they drop a treasure chest with the red experience gem. And this treasure chest is what you need in order to evolve your weapons. And if you're a gacha player like me, or if you love seeing flashy colors and the thrill of not knowing what you're going to get from something, then this treasure chest can be literal treasure chest. It works like a casino slot machine. It even has a different music accompanying it that sounds just a lot like something you'd hear from a slot machine or from a casino. But of course, this is RNG based because of course it is. So even if you have the passive items needed to evolve your weapon and your weapon is already on the max level, the treasure chest can still give you a different item and will not evolve your weapon. See, in this footage, I've had the whip at max level and its corresponding passive item ages ago, and yet the treasure chest kept giving me upgrades for and evolving other weapons. That's RNG's in the work, I guess. However, getting your weapons to evolve is so much worth it because it gives you additional damage and weapon effects that can effectively kill more enemies. Remember that flimsy knives that your character throws? Well, just look at what it turns into when you evolve it. Now that's some firepower. And guess what? You can do this for your other 5 weapons. So in the late game, if the stars align and you get everything you need to evolve all your weapons, your game will look like this. Yeah, shit gets crazy real fast. And that's only using the starting character. But of course, you cannot get all of this from the start. You must work hard for them and play the game numerous times. Vampire Survivors is after all a roguelite in essence, and replaying it a bunch of times is kind of a necessity in this kind of games. And Vampire Survivors is no exception. As of writing the script for this video, Vampire Survivors has 46 weapons in total, with more or less the same number of passive items, plus these weapons evolutions and some other hidden weapons that require a lot of planning to obtain. If you're like me that has some itch in his brain that loves to collect a bunch of stuff, Vampire Survivors will surely do satisfy that itch. Steam achievements, they are tied into your discovered items and unlock characters, so that's how many collectibles you can get in this game. And the developers seem to be adding DLCs quite frequently as well. Again, as of writing the script for this video, the game has 2 DLCs, each with their own set of additional achievements and new weapons and passive items to unlock. The fun never ends. You also may have noticed that different groups of enemies spawn. This is because the game works on a wave system where, depending on how much time you spend on the stage, the game will spawn different kinds of enemies. The very first wave usually contains hordes of enemies that are easy to kill, which will then be followed up by a wave of somewhat tougher and stronger enemies but has a lower count. Afterwards, enemies that are somewhere in the middle of the first 2 waves will chase you down to the ends of the earth. They are much tougher than the first wave but much weaker than the second wave. After this then is a wave of enemies that are stronger than the first 3 waves. If you manage to survive that, trust me, it will be hard to survive that in your first playthrough. I've unlocked everything in this game and I still almost died when they spawned, as you can see in this footage. The game will then spawn a different group of enemies and the cycle continues. This makes it so that even though the game only have a handful of enemy types and sprites, and the gameplay is just a repeat of the first 10 minutes, there's still a sense of progression as you see different enemies spawn after every few minutes. The only downside with this kind of gameplay is that your progress is tied into how much time you spend in the stage. You cannot stall until you're strong enough to handle the next wave of stronger enemies. If it's time, it's time. And when you can kill the new enemies fast enough, it's only a matter of time before they overwhelm you. Which is why you will definitely die a lot on your first few runs and will take a handful of runs before you can finally finish a stage. And lastly, this game has a lot of secrets as you can find. We've talked about references to other media and the game being a huge homage to Castlevania in the previous section, but that's not all the game has to offer. There are a lot of modifiers that you can unlock in the game to make it fresh again after playing it for 100 hours. There are additional power-ups that you can choose from, which can dictate what weapons you'll be choosing throughout the run, and mix them up and see what combination of power-ups, weapons, and passive items works the best for your playstyle. The options you see below the stage selection in this footage, you have to unlock those before you can use them. The reason why there's an endless option in the stage selection screen is because stages are only limited to 30 minutes of playtime. Once the in-game timer reaches 30 minutes, your current run will end one way or another. There's no escaping it. I won't be showing what happens when the timer reaches 30 minutes to avoid any spoilers, but just know that the game won't let you pass that mark unless you turn on endless mode. And once you turn on endless mode, the late game will turn Vampire Survivors into an idle game with this kind of craziness. But let me warn you in advance, the later stages of the base game, it becomes a horror game real fast. Not only because of the shenanigans the game has to offer, but also because of the game's horrible performance. Look, I understand that in the late game, there are a lot of things happening on the screen that even you as the player have a hard time keeping up with what's actually happening, as you can see in this footage. But that becomes so much worse when you realize, oh my god, I have 2 FPS, what the hell is happening? Sure, there are a lot of sprites on the screen and your weapons have tremendous visual effects for all 6 of them, but I don't think I believe that other bullet hell games, especially Toa Project, runs much better than this game. And it's not even about my graphics card. Vampire Survivors use like 20% of my GPU at most, and yet it slows down to a crawl when a lot of things are happening on the screen, which I really think shouldn't be happening. And this is even with the new engine that the developers have been talking about for the past few months. I guess this is the reason why the game originally is limited to just 30 minutes. The engine just couldn't handle the amount of things on the screen past it. Before we come to the conclusion of this video, I would just like to talk about the visual presentation and the music for this video game because I think they're worth to talk about. Obviously, the game uses sprite art for all character and enemy models in this game, which is of course an homage to and reminiscent of the Castlevania games. Some of the colored sprites for the playable characters are just sprite models for Alucard, while some are drawn after the Belmont sprites. They also have a Bayonetta lookalike. But then they have these sprites that I really don't know how to describe. Like this Genevieve, which according to the wiki, might be a reference to Genova from Final Fantasy VII, or Lida, which now that I think about it, might be a reference to a boss from some of the Castlevania games named Legion. The wiki also says that she, yes this character is a woman, might be a reference to a boss from Final Fantasy VIII. Remember when I said that this game has a lot of Easter eggs and references? Yeah, these are just a couple of examples. But looking at the sprites, god damn, they just look so good. Just look at this missing number sprite, which is yet another reference to perhaps one of the most well-known glitches in gaming history. These are terrifying. And the enemies are not far off either, especially with the boss and special enemies. I can't show most of these special bosses because there are some major spoilers and I think these bosses are best seen firsthand for the first time, so I'll be showing just one. This guy. I told you this game becomes a horror game. As you would expect, my initial reaction when I first encountered this boss was, what in the fresh hell is this thing? And I then proceeded to scream as it chased my character to death. But its design is just so terrifyingly awesome. And the accompanying music, my god, it's perfect. Obviously, if the game is full of references and Easter eggs from other franchises and video games, it's not a surprise that Vampire Survivors soundtrack is also inspired and an homage to Castlevania soundtracks. Here's an example from the very first stage of the game. And that's just one example. The developers offer the soundtracks as a DLC, so if you do plan on buying the game, you can consider including the soundtrack as well. And that's pretty much it for this review. Vampire Survivors is a precious gem that has graced Steam in the past few years. If you like games that have lots of moving parts and visual effects that will turn you blind that even you won't know what the hell is happening on the screen, Vampire Survivors is the game for you. Again, if you want to try the game out for yourself, the link to the game's Steam store page will be in the description below, It's so cheap you won't even have an afterthought after buying it. Make sure to get the DLCs as well for that sweet 100% achievement and for more weapons, which equates to more fun. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and perhaps toss in a subscribe at the same time. It really helps me out a lot. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.